Amanda Stockwell. Hello, hello. It's so nice to see you.
I know it's good to see you too. I'm excited to catch up.
I am too. I was thinking we've only known each other now a few months, but the conversations we've had, I feel like we know each other better than that. So I'm really excited. Even in this conversation, I know I'm going to be learning so much about your career. I'm so thrilled to be learning more. I feel like we know each other well.
I do too, but I agree. I'm like, there's all kinds of facts I don't know, but I feel like we know each other at a spiritual level.
Absolutely, absolutely. I'm excited about the work you're doing now too and learning more. Can you share a little bit about your career story, Amanda?
I begin by saying that I went to engineering school, but I was always a hesitant engineer. I was an engineer driven by scholarship dollars. So I went to engineering school and then went to a majors fair. And one of the majors had lollipops at the table. And that table was the Human Factors and Ergonomics Society. Turns out they were better at marketing than any of the other engineering groups. But also I discovered, oh, there's a field of engineering that cares about the human interaction part, the part where there's people involved with the machines. I can do that. That's a possibility. Hell yeah. So I studied human factors, ergonomics, and engineering psychology is what they called my program back in the day. I didn't know what UX was because it wasn't a very widely used term back then. But then when I graduated, I started working at a startup where I was supposed to be a UX generalist, but pretty quickly was like, oh, I like all of the part about talking to the people. And I haven't really done anything not research or strategy related since then. So I was pretty early on the I'm a research specialist train,
Mhm.
both because it's what I wanted to do and it's because what I was naturally much more inclined for, was much better at it. So I worked at a startup in my naivete, had no idea they were trying to position themselves to get purchased and left just before they did. Of course, but that's okay. It worked out. I went and worked at a large company, Staples. Had a great experience there, but didn't really want to live in Boston anymore. Had made a lot of connections in North Carolina, where I live now. Moved back, and all of my old friends from the startup had gotten new jobs because the startup had sold and they didn't work there anymore. And nobody could hire me full time, but they all had projects that I could work on. And that's how I accidentally discovered consulting. I was looking for a full-time job.
Okay.
I didn't have health insurance otherwise. I wasn't really intending to be a consultant at first, but had all of these friends who were offering me gigs. I also was extremely fortunate for a period of time after I moved away from Staples home office. I worked part-time still with my team at Staples when I moved back to North Carolina. So I worked remotely part-time for my corporate job and then started freelancing for my old friends. And then discovered once I put it out there that I was consulting, I started then, worked for a variety of different companies, and I incorporated Stockwell strategy. So I've been a happy consultant for, I guess, so 9 years. And then last year, I was fortunate enough to get the opportunity to teach at a grad program starting at Duke last year. So I started teaching grad students, which I love. And then just about 2.5 months ago, after lots of observations about some things that were missing in my community, co-founded a nonprofit.
I'd like to ask you about this inflection point that's happening right now. I know you've had several of them. You touched upon the fact that things were a little bit easier for UX consultants. The work around the 2012 period, it was like a heyday. It's not so much anymore. And one thing that I've been hearing from a lot of folks in the tech world is they're thinking about going into consulting. And this happy accident, when you first went into consulting, you also still had the safety of that part-time role. Did that help you make the leap? Or what would you tell people now when they're thinking about moving from full-time to going into consulting?
Yeah, 1,000%. There's two things to that. One is that absolutely it was easier to consult while I still had some security. I wasn't working full time, but I had some income. And also just like my personal circumstances, I moved in with the boyfriend who is now my husband at that time. It was a good time for me to take a risk like that. But I also didn't really know what I was doing. It was not intentional. Something that I say all the time to people who are considering consulting is that, especially if you're new, you have to have your craft so on lock that you are not thinking about your ability to do the work. That has to be a given. And then you have to, like, what most small business owners or solopreneurs spend most of their time doing, or most of their hard effort doing, is all of the other stuff about building a business that does not have to do with your ability to do the work. So the very best researcher in the entire world might be the worst consultant. And also, doing work as a consultant is different than doing work inside a team, inside a company. I had to spend time learning things like accounting and reaching out to people for work. It's not for everybody. I like it, frankly, because I have ADHD.
Mhm.
I like working on new projects all the time. I like new challenges. I like learning new contexts. I like juggling 37 things. That's how my brain works. That does not work at all for some people. It very much stresses them out. And
Absolutely.
you have to, when you are considering if you should consult, you need to think about that kind of thing because you
Mhm.
might be able to power through it for a little while and be successful, but you are going to hate every second.
When you were talking about your work at Duke, you lit up. This was 2024 when you started working there. How did the Duke engagement come to be? Was this your strategy or how did you land there?
Yeah, so this is not good in terms of advice because this is not a good strategy. I did not have a strategy other than to rely back to the let yourself be known and let yourself be open to opportunities. A friend of mine who lives here met the director of the program at a conference. He was interested in having her come on board, but she was too busy at the time, and she recommended me. I had never considered teaching in higher ed before. I did not go to grad school myself. I was totally fucking intimidated. But I know first of all, when they described the course and what they wanted to teach, I was like, oh, well, I do that all the time. I know that. Okay, yeah, that's fine. And when they were asking me about my experience teaching, and I was like, oh, well, I did teach at a boot camp and I have taught my peers lots of times and I've done custom training. And if I can teach my peers, I'm pretty sure I can handle grad students, even really smart ones.
Mhm. Mhm.
So that opportunity came from a recommendation. Thanks, Melissa. I think the number one most important thing in anyone's career is their network. I know it's a cliche to say it's not what you know, it's who you know, especially if you want to be a consultant. You have to know people. When I think back on inflection points, nearly every opportunity that I have had in my career has come from someone I met, some connection I made. There's a person that I have done something like 3 dozen projects with. The reason I met him is because I sat next to someone else I had met once before at a conference, and he and I started chatting, and now we're friends and do lots of work together.
Thank you for sharing, Amanda. It was a little hidden secret for a while. It's not so hidden anymore. But what I've been trying to uncover from people like you and women like you, quite accomplished in the space, is seeing if there's patterns that we can synthesize from our stories and our lessons learned. And the fact that you're bringing up it is all about your network. It is all about the connections and relationships. This theme has been coming up over and over from the accomplished women I've spoken to. And it's my favorite question because I never know how people will respond. But I'm thinking now, you've accomplished quite a lot in your career. And one thing I'm wondering, you talked about the importance of a network, but when you think back to when you were first starting out, having no idea you would go to a table with a lollipop and lollipops and move into this space, I'm wondering if you could go back and speak to yourself back then, based on what you've learned in your career, what are one or two things you would tell yourself as you were starting out?
Yeah. So the connection one is a huge piece of it, but the first thing that actually pops into my head, it's not advice per se, but I think it's a nugget of wisdom that can lead to lots of advice. It's that no one knows what the fuck they're doing 100% of the time. And I think that having that nugget of wisdom can unlock a lot of good pieces of feedback, such as imposter syndrome comes up all the time. And I kind of look at that as fear of not having all of the answers. Well, when you realize that no one has all of the answers, it makes it less scary to act, right? Or it makes it less scary to put yourself out there or try some things. The other thing in relation to all of that is that there's a thing about success being some amount of preparation and some amount of luck. And there's a lot of discussion around what is preparation and what is luck and can you influence luck. But I think that just putting yourself out there and trying some stuff and being okay with different versions of success. Just try some stuff, but also be true to yourself and recognize that there are different versions of success. And sometimes the success is that you learned something. Sometimes the success is that you learned what you never want to do again. I will never work in a fucking agency ever, ever again. Ever again. But I don't consider that time period a failure. I learned a lot. It just wasn't meant to be my long-term solution, and that's okay.
This inclination to act. I've been working with people to map out their next act, whether it's their career act or life act. And what's been really fascinating is the people I've talked to, they really already have a sense of vision for a next act. It's not a lot of work there. But they've also said that they've had that vision for years and
Mhm.
just still having difficulty to take that action. You talked about realizing that no one else knows what they're doing. Are there other strategies? It sounds like this has just been something that you've done since early in your career, taking action. But for those
Yeah.
people who are still holding back, what would you tell these folks who are struggling with those actions, even when they're small?
Yeah. So you're right that it is just my personality. I definitely have a bias towards action.
Mhm.
Sometimes that gets me in trouble. It just is my personality. And I think the thing that people say to me all the time is they're like, "Oh, you're so fearless. Can't believe you started a nonprofit. That's incredible. You like I would be so scared." And I'm like, I'm terrified. I don't know exactly what's going to happen in 6 months. I don't know what's going to happen in 12 months. I have a hope for it, a vision for what it could look like. But I guess the thing is that like time's going to keep moving whether I go after the thing that I wanted to or not. I had heart surgery as a little kid, and I think that set me up with a perspective of life is short, make it the way you want it to be. The advice part is feel the fear, but do it anyway. And even if you just take one small step, it'll get easier to take more. It's usually the hardest part is that first step, that first kind of sense. But the other piece is that you don't have to know what all of the steps are to get from point A to point B. I had no idea what it would look like to run a consultancy when I started. I figured it out along the way. And so far, there hasn't been anything that I haven't been able to figure it out with. You can figure it out if you want to, if you care about it. And don't let being afraid drive you to not make decisions because in almost every case, the worst thing that happens is that you learn something. As an example, with the list, the current nonprofit that I started, what literally happened is that I ran into my co-founder at a co-working event. We were chit-chatting about what we were each working on. I had been in a period of reflection of trying to find a more meaningful way to channel my work. And so I was open to opportunities, but he started telling me about the nugget of an idea that he had. I asked him if he wanted help. By 2 weeks later, we had a website, a pitch deck, and we had started recruiting people. Would it have been helpful if I had paused and thought through all of the things that I needed to do? Maybe, but do I regret saying, do you need help in that moment? Not at all.
Yep, yep. Oh, okay. Amanda, I'd like to dig deep a little bit.
Yep.
I recall our first conversation, and we both were connecting around trying to figure things out. I've been describing it as this messy middle. You know that you want to shift, but you're not quite sure what the other side will be. Can we talk about this? So, from an outside perspective, your consultancy has been thriving. You've had powerhouse companies that you've worked with. You're a connector. You have many followers. Life is good. And yet you were figuring out what was next and what would add meaning. Can you share with me and us a little bit what was happening?
Yeah, so let me also say again, I have always been proactive. And so a piece of advice that I have is be proactive. If you are starting to feel like this job, this role, this whatever isn't 100% the best thing for me, don't wait until it gets fucking miserable to do something about it. So this stems all the way back to my very first real job, which I will say, by the way, in retrospect, was pretty great. We had a good supportive team. We had a cool product. We were successful in terms of it was a startup, but it grew and then sold. Some of my very best friends and my husband I met there, but I was bored and I was 22 and I was like, I should not already feel like I have learned everything that I could at this place. But then I started applying for jobs and that's when I got that corporate job and moved back to Boston and I made just about double what I made at my first job. When I decided to leave Staples, things were actually going great there, but life-wise, I wanted to be back in North Carolina. I wanted to be back with the community I had built there. In almost every case, it's just paying attention to yourself and what is happening. And so in this most recent time, I had been feeling what I thought was burnout for a while. But this was just right after the pandemic. I had 3 extremely busy years. I had a lot of stuff going on in my personal life. I was like, fair enough, you're tired. Take some time, figure out how to work through that and get to the other side of burnout, whatever that looks like. I was doing all of this stuff to try to feel differently about my situation, and it was kind of working, but there was still that niggling, just I need more, I want something different. I realized what I was looking for was more meaning. I got to this point where I was like, I don't want to use my skills to sell any more shit. I have this expertise, but I want it to be used for good. And so at first I was like, maybe I should just only start working for certain kinds of clients. That's kind of where my head was at. Then I got the opportunity to teach, and I was like, oh, maybe I wasn't burnt out. Maybe I just actually hate my job.
Well, you were seeing the difference, right? Was your light coming back?
Yes. And I think it was in some ways incredibly stressful because it was new and I was very invested in it and I wanted to do a good job and I felt like I didn't always know what I was doing. But to your point, I'm not good at hiding my facial expressions.
Hmm.
And every
Hmm.
time I talked about helping students, I felt that buoyed feeling. I felt myself smiling. I felt myself excited. And so when I then sort of forced myself onto my friend Renbin, I think it was a recognition of an opportunity to do something that I had been looking for. So
Mhm.
the list for me is an opportunity to do something meaningful with my particular blend of skills. I was actively trying to figure out what else can I be doing, how else can I channel this, etc.
I wanted to ask you about these life inflection points because it's a theme that comes up across the board. Moving in a new direction and being in this middle of uncertainty, it can bring up a lot of feelings. And what I'm seeing many, many people trying to do is control the outcome, like feel like, okay, I can figure out how to reach this next act by controlling everything. And when you share this story, and we'll delve in more around the list, you weren't controlling, you were connecting, you were exploring. Do you have advice for people? I haven't felt like trying to control the situation leads to that other side, but what's your take?
Yeah, that's such a good point, and I don't know that I recognized it quite in that lens until just right now when you said it, but all of the major inflection points in my career were a gamble. They were all things that I was like, I don't know, let's try it. I think that kind of goes back to my other advice too, which is that women in particular have this bias towards if I don't 100% feel like I am prepared to do this successfully, then I will not do it. And for whatever brain chemistry experience combination I have, my brain is like, what's the worst that could happen? But to your point, in reflection, all of the things that have been the most successful have been things that I have taken a chance on. I had no idea how they were going to turn out. I remember the first time that I applied to speak at a conference. I was terrified. I literally don't remember how many times I've spoken at a conference now. Things that were once scary, you figure it out. To your point, also, that there's a certain amount of letting go that you have to do when you are entering a new space. Not that long ago, I saw a brief clip of a guest talk of another professor at Duke. She was talking about the messy middle and learning and how from point A to point B is always a hot mess in here. And the primary feeling between not knowing something and knowing something is frustration. And most of us traditionally, our traditional, at least in America, our traditional sense of success is get from point A to point B faster, as fast as possible. And her whole contention is that the actual most successful people are the people who are actually just able to tolerate the messy middle and that frustration for the longest. Because what ends up happening is that the other side climbs up and up. The longer you're in the middle, the better the other side looks. And the primary thing that I took away from that is I should be feeling confused, scared, and overwhelmed right now. I just did something I have no
Mhm.
experience in. Of course, I'm stressed. It's not like I'm always calm and stoic about it, but recognizing that that messy middle feeling is the right feeling if you're looking to get to point B. So if you never want to deal with that messy middle yucky feeling, that's okay. But that means you're always going to be at A. And that,
Yeah. One thing that popped into my head is that messy middle, if you're not hopping right from A to B, is where you can try to spend some time and reflect, what is this messiness teaching me or trying to teach me? Have you had those moments before you started the nonprofit as you were still exploring? Did you have lessons learned? I know you're still somewhat in the messy middle, but what has this time taught you?
yeah. Well, what I will say is in the middle of the mess is not usually when I have insight. Usually it's after.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
When you can look back, right?
Hmm.
So it's usually once you have some time and distance from something, at least for me, that I can look back and extract meaning or
Hmm.
insight from
Hmm.
it. So actually, I think that in and of itself is a lesson is that while you're in the messy middle, reflect if you want to, but don't force yourself to try to decide right now or figure it out right now
Like,
or be like,
what is the lesson?
yeah,
There's an element of control there
if I
too.
knew what the lesson was, I would have learned it already.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, okay, so you launched the list, you and your co-partner with
Yeah.
the nonprofit. Tell us about the list and what the charter and mission is behind it.
Yes. So the list is a nonprofit aimed at better connecting university students to the startup ecosystem. And we're starting specifically in the Triangle of North Carolina because that's where I live. The reason they call it the Triangle is because there's Raleigh, Durham, and Chapel Hill in kind of a triangle. And there is Duke, UNC, and NC State in those three towns. And there are many other schools around here too. So higher ed is very big around here. Tech is pretty big around here, and we have a pretty strong and growing startup scene. There is a lot of entrepreneurship focus for students who want to build their own business in each of those schools. But what we observed, and one of the things that we wanted to fill, is that there's not great connection between students who might want to work at a startup that someone else is running. And there's just not like great all over ecosystem cohesion. And additionally, we have so many incredible students who graduate and then are like, cool, I'm going to Silicon Valley. Peace.
Mhm.
And we have a great community here. And in a lot of ways, like this is where I moved right after college. And one of the reasons I did is because I could afford a life that I wanted. We want smart people to stay here. We want to invest in the community. And then there's another element which is important to me that I went to engineering school and then I have worked in technology and especially in the startup space. The representation in the room did not look anything like the representation in the classrooms that I see. And there's a lot of reasons why. It's not specific to North Carolina necessarily, but there are very few women founders. There are not that many women working in the startup space generally. And the racial diversity is not at all on par with not only the academic community, but our community in general. So, one of the things that we really wanted to do is create better, more accessible pathways for students to get into the startup ecosystem. So, the list is started as an idea to match students to local startup internships. And then, as any good startup and as a researcher, I immediately started getting feedback. I started talking to anyone who would talk to me. I went to a lot of coffee dates and realized that there was some nuance to it. It wasn't just that we needed to match students, it's that startups don't typically have the time, energy, or resources to hire an intern. And a lot of internship programs from the student's perspective, unless they are at a very large organization that has a whole team dedicated to making internships successful, internships don't necessarily work out that well for students either. They don't necessarily learn a lot. And there's still somewhat of a gap between you might know the skills, the technical skills or the research skills or the design skills, but do you know how to work in an office? And whatever you've probably heard, is that relevant today and in a startup? Maybe yes, maybe no. So the list is there's a matching element to it, but I'm also building programming where I help the startups frame problems that students can solve. And I'm working on programming from the student end to teach them some of those kind of basic workplace readiness things, help mentor them and guide them along the way throughout the process. And we have raised some, would love to raise more. If anyone is listening, our intention is to be able to raise money so that we can pay the students a fair wage but give the startups a significant discount
Hmm.
on hiring an intern so that more diverse startup founders can afford the help that they would get from an intern, which
Hmm.
typically they don't get until they are already pretty well funded.
What have you
Yeah.
learned that you're now bringing to the list now? What new expertise are you gaining?
Yeah. Well, also, early 2025, the worst possible time to be looking
Mhm.
for funding. So, I think a couple of things. So, the whole grant and nonprofit funding space, I'm still 100% learning. I'm in the middle of learning that. I'm early in the messy middle there. That is new to me. And I was talking to someone saying, like, oh, I don't like sales. And they were like, what do you mean? You're great at
Yeah.
sales. Like, your business has been so successful. And I was like, yeah, but I'm selling me. And I'm selling my ability to be able to do the work that someone has said that they needed. That I'm fine with. But this just like asking people for money out of the goodness of their hearts
Mhm.
piece, that's way different. So I'm still learning. I'm in very much in the messy middle, but what I'll say is two things. One is partner with people, right? Get help. So Runbin, my co-founder, and it was his idea. He's been fundraising for the last year for his startup. So we are relying heavily on a lot of his connections and a lot of conversations that he's facilitating. We're also intentionally trying to build partnerships and relationships with other players in the ecosystem who have already been doing this kind of thing, are already talking about it. So I'm like actively leaning on other people, but I'm still very much beginning,
Hmm.
beginning of the messy middle part. But I will say, having served tech startups multiple times, I have enough knowledge about the startup space that I don't feel like a beginner there.
Hmm.
I just feel like a beginner from the nonprofit side of it. Like the ecosystem doesn't feel intimidating to me, but the trying to plug ourselves in as a nonprofit, I don't know, ask me in 6 months.
Well, it sounds like you're okay with it too. Back to like taking a growth mindset that you're learning along the way. That's what you do. You jump in and you learn what you need to, and that's okay, right? Like you didn't just say, oh, I need to know everything about the nonprofit space. You're building a nonprofit.
Yeah. And I think that I looked at it essentially as I thought about the outcome, not the process. So like when I like start to get stressed about it, I
Hmm.
remind myself that absolutely worst case scenario, I get like a couple of startups some help this summer and I provide an opportunity for a couple of students who wouldn't have otherwise had one. So worst case scenario, if we never find more funding, if we can never get ourselves in a financial place, because we're not doing anything to currently to take in income. Startups pay us, but all of that money goes directly to the students. I also want to say that I'm able to take this risk now because of a strong place of privilege. I've had a strong business for a long time. I'm married to someone who has a job. And I wasn't intentionally planning to take 6 to 9 months and not have a ton of income, but I had been setting things up for a while for some kind of shift.
And you
So I,
could do that. Yes.
so I could make it work. And so I want to be very clear that that is an extreme privilege that
Hmm.
I don't take for granted and that I recognize that that's not something I could have done 10 years ago and wouldn't necessarily recommend it for someone depending on where they're currently at in their life. Like you have to be realistic about your life, especially right now.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And it's important to recognize that too. Thank you, Amanda. Do you have time for one more
Yeah.
question? You were talking about it's a priority of your nonprofit to be thinking about diversity and inclusion and balance and all of these amazing things we should be thinking about. I'm wondering, as a woman who's been navigating the tech world, do you have advice for people in this position? Have you had challenges along the way?
Sometimes you can tell when someone doesn't take you seriously. Also, just some of the pressure of very frequently being the only woman in the room, or when people are joking around and then you walk in the room and everyone's awkwardly silent. And I think maybe it helped that I had an older brother and that also I went to engineering school, but I just learned to be like, that's your problem. And so some of it is just a confidence about my ability to help. I think, especially as a UX researcher, I always took the approach very much of if I do my job well, your job will be easier. So we're collaborating. I'm here to help. I'm not here to have all the answers. I'm here for us to build those answers together. So some of it I think is in my approach. Some of it is in don't be afraid to show off what you do know. I don't code anymore, but I know that what you're telling me is bullshit if you say we can't build that thing.
Mhm.
And I will tell you that I know that it's bullshit. So there's some of that of being confident about what you know, but having an approach of we are a cohesive unit. We are doing this together. It's not me versus you, one skill set versus another, one team versus another. This is about ultimately we want to build a thing that is good for our users and helps our organization, right? But I think also that I'm good at calling people on their bullshit when they're being obviously misogynistic
Mhm.
or obviously biased. And I'm not going to pretend that it's not. And I know that women often get framed as being a bitch or too harsh, but I have a favorite phrase, which I recommend everyone use, which is, how did you come to that conclusion? Tell me how you got there. And I say it real neutrally. And I don't assume any wrongdoing in the immediate response. But if someone says something that is blatantly against like all of the UX recommendations that I've been making, for example, I'm like, where did that come from? Tell me why you think that's the best solution. And it gives you the opportunity to call people out in a way that doesn't feel like them being called out. And sometimes I hate this, but sometimes white dudes need someone to be like, shut the fuck up.
Yeah.
It
Yeah.
sounds great. Or just because you're saying it louder doesn't mean I believe you more.
Yeah.
Like, and I think being able, having the confidence to push back a little bit, but kindly.
While you were telling your stories, I was thinking about, I was talking to a former colleague who was at a leadership offsite where it was a bunch of leaders in the room, C-level and senior directors. And at the end of the offsite, it was very celebratory. And the CEO did say, you know what, this has been fantastic. We had many perspectives. We got a lot out of this. And she was the only woman in the room. And she said, to your point, she didn't say, hey, I'm the only woman. She said, and maybe next year we can have a bit more representation. And the people in the room went, aha. They didn't even recognize this issue until she spoke up.
Yeah, and I hate that that's a thing that we have to contend with. I wish I
Yeah.
could say, speak up, but we're anchored in reality here.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I think the other thing, and this is similarly not something that I love, but don't be afraid to like swing your credentials around or swing your experience around. If you have an elite degree or if you have a very good skill set or if you've worked with very big clients, I hate that this is true, but sometimes people treat you differently. I can say having the experience being a professor now, dropping that I'm a professor at Duke sometimes gets people to look at me differently. And I kind of hate it, but I'm also like, well, I am. I'm not making it up. And it's on you if you treat me differently, but I'm also not afraid to use it if
Mhm.
it's true. And I don't like that I do that sometimes because I don't like that we live in a world where that's true. But I also sometimes can recognize the space that I'm in and be like, well, they're probably going to appreciate that in a way that they don't appreciate that I am also a fitness instructor. So, like,
Absolutely.
and then I think the last one, and this again, this is personal for me, but it goes back to the connector thing. I don't do an authentic connection or relationship. And so if I'm going to work with someone, I legitimately try to get to know them as a person. And I care about and remember what their kids' names are, or their lizard's name is, or that they were going to that music festival last weekend, or that they like banana bread. And so I'll bring them some when I make it or whatever. Being a nice person and being genuinely curious and caring about the people that you're surrounded by has always gotten me good things. And I don't do it to get good things, but I realized somewhere along the way, I was like, oh, it really helped me that I remembered their name or where they were last weekend or whatever.
And
Um,
people know when it's genuine too. They can see that. Absolutely, Amanda.
and who doesn't want to be remembered? Who doesn't want to make a little connection with someone about the sports team they like or their dog or whatever? Building those actual connections and relationships with people. Again, it sometimes can help you break through some of the other bullshit that gets
Mhm.
associated with being a
Mhm.
woman.
Amanda, thank you for taking the time today. This was super, super fun. I learned a lot. Thank you for sharing.
Yeah, thanks for having me. This is so great. And I think it's obvious that we're going to have to talk again.
Yes, absolutely. That's what I was going to say. I'm already thinking it really, really struck me that when we are in the messy middle, we don't necessarily have all of the lessons learned, processed yet. So coming back, I also, with my audience, this whole notion of building something that's really meaningful for yourself and serving others, the work you're doing with the list, I'd love to hear where you're ending up there. So thank you.
Well, I hope I have a great story to tell you.
Well, as you said, there's always a story. You just don't know where it will end up, but I'm sure it's going to be fascinating no matter what happens.
Like, it's either a good story or a good lesson, right?
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you. We'll talk really soon.
Thank you so much.